WVW Broadcast Network and The New American are pleased to present The New American TV with your host, Rebecca Terrell. This broadcast is committed to helping you understand the truth behind the news. And now, here's your host, Rebecca Terrell.
Welcome to The New American TV, where we bring you the truth behind the news. Today is Thursday, February 9th, and here are some of the headlines we're following. Legendary investigative reporter Seymour Hersh is back with a bombshell. On his Substack, he published a detailed piece titled How America Took Out the Nord Stream Pipeline. Perhaps it shouldn't come as much of a surprise, given that Joe Biden threatened to bring an end to Nord Stream 2.
If Russia invades, that means tanks or troops crossing the border of Ukraine again. Then there will be no longer a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it.
Victoria Nuland of the State Department made similarly ominous statements.
If President Putin moves on Ukraine, our expectation is that the pipeline will be suspended.
The West's interference in Nord Stream 2 notwithstanding, Seymour Hersh casts light on the players and methods behind an attack that now threatens Europe's energy security, completely rejecting the West's claims that the Russian state may be sabotaging its own pipelines. Hersh attributes the decision to take out the pipeline to Victoria Nuland, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. Collaborating with President Biden and the CIA, the key participants created a plan and executed it with the help of the Norwegian Naval Special Forces and the elite divers of the U.S. Navy's Diving and Salvage Center. Under the cover of a NATO exercise called Baltops 22, the team executed the mission to perfection. The conspirators later attempted to obfuscate with far-fetched proclamations that the Russians may have attacked their own pipeline. Now that the truth is out, the major open question is, what exactly comes next? The House Oversight Committee met yesterday to discuss how and why Twitter covered up the Hunter Biden laptop story. 4 former senior Twitter employees testified before lawmakers. Republicans Andy Biggs of Arizona, Jim Jordan of Ohio, and Nancy Mace of South Carolina held their feet to the fire.
Did the U.S. government ever contact you or anyone at Twitter to pressure Twitter to moderate or censor certain tweets? Yes or no?
We have a program.
Did the U.S. government ever contact you or anyone at Twitter to censor or moderate certain tweets? Yes or no?
We receive legal demands to remove content from the platform from the U.S. government and governments all around the world. Those are published on a third-party website.
We also got a glimpse of full-blown Trump derangement syndrome that gripped Twitter's headquarters in the heady days prior to Elon Musk's acquisition of the social media giant.
But it was a news article that I had read in which the former president said that he liked to send out his tweets like little missiles. To me, that sounded exactly like weaponization of a platform, in his own words, and yet Twitter was not concerned.
And in one of the stranger moments of the day, the lights went out while Alabama Republican Gary Palmer was speaking.
In 2018, the Iranian Ayatollah Khomeini.
When the lights came back on, he said, "Sounds like the Green New Deal to me." And that is exactly what we can expect from Washington's environmental tyranny. Meanwhile, amidst all the discussion about Joe Biden's State of the Union speech earlier this week, little attention is paid to one statement he made.
We launched the ARPA-H drive for breakthrough in the fights against cancer, Alzheimer's, and diabetes, and so much more.
The president was referring to ARPA-H, or the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health, which is an arm of the National Institutes of Health. Operating with a budget exceeding $5 billion, the project is modeled after DARPA, but focused on investigating health breakthroughs. Studying biomedical and molecular to social health outcomes, ARPA-H wants to do for health what DARPA did for technology. DARPA is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency and has brought us innovations such as the Brainstorms Project, which is injectable nanobots that allow for wireless, hands-free brain-to-computer interface, a two-way communication. Daniel Natal is joining us from the New American Magazine. What exactly do you think that health courtesy of the National Institutes of Health will look like?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there was a book by Alec Ross. He was the tech czar for Hillary Clinton and Obama, and it was called Industries of the Future. And he said the fortunes of the late 20th century were going to be based on binary code. And he said, the tech sector isn't right. He said in the 21st century, it's going to be based on the genetic code. And so that's why Bill Gates jumped out of tech and went into like biomedical. And you see the U.S. government kind of doing the same thing, where they're, like COVID was a brilliant example of kind of DARPA projects that manifested as kind of money-making vehicles. So that's very discomforting. Not quite as discomforting as the Sy Hersh revelations regarding the Nord Stream pipeline. That is in the article. One of the people, the whistleblowers talking to him, said that that's an act of war to sabotage a pipeline, another country's pipeline, and to blow it up. So this is huge news. So what are your thoughts on that, Rebecca?
Yeah, well, I mean, it just shows that the major media is not really giving us the full story, but that's no surprise. They normally don't. It's kind of discouraging to feel that we're in some way the bad guys here.
Well, yeah, just so that our viewers understand, and we hit this point a couple days ago, I think, is that there's this geographer from 1904 named Sir Halford Mackinder, and he basically said that it is not in the interest of England or now the United States, the Atlantic countries, to allow Germany, Russia, and China to unite, because then that would create Eurasia. And so all of the 20th century, the wars have been based on separating Germany from Russia. Like Germany wants Russia's petroleum for their industry, and Russia wants German technology. And so if they do peaceful trade, that's good for those countries. It's bad, however, for the Atlantic powers. So everything is about stopping Germany, sabotaging Germany, and kind of like the Green New Deal, which you mentioned with the gentleman saying that the lights went out. This is the Green New Deal. If you want to sabotage a country, you cut off energy. And I just wanted to really quickly, I had this this great book from Harvard called The Atlas of Economic Complexity, and it's done by Ricardo Hausmann. And he basically shows like the economies of various countries around the world, and it's very illustrative of why countries attack other countries, like what raw materials they have, what products use those raw materials. And in the book, you can see Russia, has like 36% of their economy is oil. And one of their biggest trading partners is Germany at 7.9%, where they pass on that energy so that Germany can run its factories. About 11% of Germany's economy is automotive and manufacturing. So they need energy for their heavy industry, their light industry. And if NATO sabotages that, what's basically happening is the sabotage of Germany, so that a strong Europe can't emerge and it just remains under NATO occupation. So that's really interesting how close, the public doesn't understand how close we are to a possible hot war.
Right. Absolutely. And it's a 1-2 punch as well, because they're not just targeting energy. They're also targeting our farmers, both in Europe as well as in the United States.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, even that's part of it. Fertilizer. Fertilizer is in the Ukraine and Russia, and they're chopping off fertilizer. So that's even affecting food supply chains. So, these are really interesting revelations. And Norway went along with it, by the way, because Norway, almost as big a part of their economy as Russia, petroleum, kind of occupies that. I think it's, Russia is like 36% and Norway, I believe is 34%. And so they were under the understanding that if they allowed NATO to use Norway as a platform for sabotaging Russia, that Norway would be able to sell cheap oil to Germany and make more money. So all of the pieces are kind of coming together. So it is interesting.
It is. It's very interesting. I want to bring up one more story here and get your thoughts on this, because I think it's pretty important. The Church of England is considering using gender-neutral language when referring to God. Priests in the UK, in the Anglican Church, have in some cases decided to refer to God with they and them pronouns, and they now refer to God as our Father and Mother. Let's take a look at this.
Is our Father actually a woman?
What an interesting question. I mean, I think for millennia, we've tried to find words to speak about God. And in a sense, that's always been part of the Christian challenge. It's part of the challenge of any religion. I think we need to, I think the arguments over whether changing our Father to be more gender neutral can very easily end up to be sort of, curtain twitching moral panic. In a sense, we're just talking about trying to find ways of talking about God as we begin to develop our language, as we understand more and more about human beings in the modern world. So is God our Father? Well, Jesus calls God our Father. Is God a man? Absolutely not. And the entire history of Christian theology, and indeed Jewish theology before it, would support that position.
All right, so we have become so degraded that we are actually dragging God into our gender-confused culture. What are your thoughts on this, Daniel?
Yeah, drag is the operative term. There was like Cicero, he said, the closer that an empire comes to collapse, the crazier the laws become. And so at the end of the Roman Empire, as they were collapsing, instead of discussing their debased currency, instead of discussing their roads, the Roman Senate was actually debating the gender of angels. And so you see, this is like a diversionary tactic, so that you don't talk about like substantive secular things, which is what their purview is. They start talking about, what is God's gender, or what is, it really is remarkable, like how similar, that the processes are for the kind of, when a society goes into dementia, the signs are very similar. So, it is interesting to watch.
I see it as a clear signal that they actually don't believe in God, at least not the God that they claim to believe in. I think that Anglicans claim to be Christians, and so they would believe in the Trinity. And Jesus himself in the Bible refers to God as his Father, which is masculine. Yeah, our society, I think you're exactly right. Our society has lost its mind, and this is just a symptom of it.
Yeah, for instance, gender was used. Gender is like in Spanish, like this cup has a gender, a spoon has a gender, like the camera has a gender. So it's just, and 99% of the languages that exist now or that have ever existed have gender, and they don't denote, like genitory organs. They denote, the passive principle or the active principle. And so the masculine was seen as the active principle. And since God was, the active creator of the universe, they naturally, in almost all cultures, but then there were passive principles as well, that they would, have goddesses or whatever. And so that's actually what it was about. Wittgenstein goes into this, the philosopher, about how, language shapes perception. And so this is really just a very cynical way to reshape our perception of God and to materialize God, to bring God down and kind of, to our level and our confusion. And so, it's not us aspiring up to be God as an archetype. It's dragging God down to be Sam Smith, as an example. So.
Right. And unfortunately, we've run out of time for this break. Thank you so much, Daniel, for your insights there. And we encourage everyone to visit us at thenewamerican.com, where we are covering these headlines and more. And we will see you on the other side of this break.
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Declaration of Independence proclaims God-given rights, and we intend to protect them. Working with people like you for over 50 years, preserving freedom and building a better tomorrow. Safeguarding the Constitution by limiting government power. We are restoring liberties, educating voters, and leading the freedom movement. Join with us. United, we will defend our rights. We are all Americans. We are the John Birch Society.
Hi, I'm Alan Keyes. I'm the host of IMTV's daily talk show about news and events in America. And I want to say a good word for the New American magazine. Not only because Alex Newman has joined us as somebody who is periodically hosting a show, but because New American magazine represents a alternative media that is willing to tell people the truth. With so much fake news spreading about, and the fact that right now this country's in an existential crisis, we remember who we are and where we come from and what our principles are, or we die. Reading New American magazine can keep you up to the minute on the issues that are challenging us as a people and on which that survival hangs. You can check it out and subscribe at www.thenewamerican.com.
Imprisonment, forced labor, permanent separation from my family, perhaps death. I knew what could happen to people who were caught trying to defect, but the watchtowers stood yards away. The possibility of a new life in a different world, one without tyranny, was within sight. The West. I thought of the rewards no longer crushed under the boot of communism. I would work and make money, no longer restrained by the chains of collectivism. I would say what I wanted, without fear of spies and informants nearby. I would be free. The frozen rain and Romanian mud seeped through my gloves and cloths. I fantasized about the fire burning in the wood stove of my parents' home, but I pushed those thoughts from my mind, closed my eyes, and waited for the cover of the darkness.
Get Defector, a true story of tyranny, liberty, and purpose by Mark Hobafkovich with Paul Dragu, a thrilling page-turner that will remind you how precious yet vulnerable freedom is. Available at shopjbs.org or Amazon. For a limited time, get 20% off your entire order using promo code Defector20 when you purchase Defector at shopjbs.org.
They say I'm part of a global plan. I don't think so. It's too hot, it's too cold. You know what? The weather changes.
Here's the news, Dad.
Nope. It's hard to tell what's real and what's fake these days.
Ditch the fake news and always get the truth. Go to thenewamerican.com.
Welcome back to the New American TV, where we bring you the truth behind the news. During last weekend's Grammy Awards presentation, sodomite Sam Smith paraded around the stage singing the song Unholy in a red leather devil costume as fellow performers gyrated with huge dancing flames as a backdrop. Let's take a look.
The 65th Grammy Awards is sponsored by Pfizer.
Actually, we couldn't show very much of it because it's rather offensive, but it's interesting that Pfizer sponsored this year's Grammy Awards. But this is no isolated occurrence. Overt demonic messages permeate the music industry. Last year's Grammys included a nomination for Best Video of the song called Call Me By Your Name. It was released by a sodomite rapper known by the stage name of Lil Nas X and depicts him engaged in an act of unnatural vice with Satan. Back in 2012, Nicki Minaj simulated demonic possession in her Grammy performance. Here it goes. Not to be outdone, Grammy darling Billie Eilish released the All the Good Girls Go to Hell a few years ago. Here's that. Joining me now to discuss the seeming gravitational pull of the occult on today's youth is the New American contributor Selwyn Duke. Selwyn, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Rebecca. It's great to be with you.
Well, it's nice to have you. So we've asked God to leave our schools and our society, and this is what we get. Should we be surprised here?
No, we shouldn't be surprised at all. And it's interesting, Rebecca, because you mentioned that Pfizer was sponsoring one of those performances. So it occurred to me that first they were killing people with their vaccines, right? Their bodies they were killing, and now they're killing people's souls with the entertainment they're sponsoring. But it's not surprising at all. And it's interesting because I watched some of these videos, Rebecca, and I want to take this in a different direction because something occurred to me. Anyone who's read my writings for the last 20 years knows that a recurring theme is that I inveigh against moral relativism. Now, moral relativism, of course, is the idea that what we call morality is determined by man. It's a function of the time, the place, and the people. In other words, it's just a function of collective preference. Therefore, morality properly understood doesn't really exist. And of course, a corollary of this is that everything's a matter of perspective. There really isn't any right or wrong. And furthermore, of course, then, there's no good or evil. You know, we know for a long time the left was using this idea to justify all sorts of transgressions. Well, those are your values. Don't impose them on me. But here's the thing. If there's no good or evil, then there also can't be good or evil angels, right? Now, I make this point in this way because if you're a believer, a person of faith, you watch those performances and you're a guest. But many people today are secularists, as you know. So it's important to deal with this on the philosophical level. This is a natural outgrowth of the characteristic philosophical disease of our time, relativism, which has been running rampant. Again, if there's no good or evil, there can't be good or bad angels, and so then everything is just a flavor of the day. And then it makes sense that there are performers who would do this to make money, right?
It does. Absolutely, absolutely. So what is that opposing virtue to relativism?
Well, it's the knowledge, and I don't say belief, I say knowledge that absolute truth exists. And of course, truth implies God, because without God, there is no truth. And of course, it's the only thing that makes sense, because if you believe that there's no truth, then you can't logically justify anything. I mean, once you spread the relativistic notion around, then you've set the stage, Rebecca, for great evil to occur, because rape, kill, steal, why not? Who's to say it's wrong? And this is the morass we've been descending into in our society for a very, very long time. I mean, G.K. Chesterton was complaining about this in the early 1900s. In his 1905 book, Heretics, he was talking about it. So it's been a long time problem that really started with the Enlightenment, to be honest with you, and it's been getting worse and worse. And this is why philosophy is so important. People hear that word philosophy and it sounds very boring and dry, but the ancient Greeks understood that philosophy lies at the heart of everything. If you're not philosophically sound, then everything else is for naught, because philosophy is one of those first things as they're known. It's like the roots, and if the roots are rotten, the tree is not going to be good, the fruit is not going to be good. If you're not philosophically sound, you can't be a good teacher, you can't be a good doctor, you can't be a good lawyer or a politician. Everything flows from that, and we're seeing the consequences now in our society of the embrace of this misbegotten philosophy of relativism, which of course is a corollary of atheism, because if there is atheism, if atheism is truth or is reality, let's put it that way, then of course, who's to say what's right or wrong? There is only man to come up with his preferences. That's all there is. And understand when I talk about this philosophically, Rebecca, I'm not saying that that's all there is to it. Obviously, people are very, very emotional beings. We know that they're influenced by feelings more than by reason, unfortunately. And of course, when you have the internet and you have all these modern forms of communication transmitting cultural garbage into people's homes 24/7, it's going to have an effect, especially when people, the young, see that others are accepting it, right? People tend to be creatures of the flock, whether we like it or not. So that's a major aspect to this as well. The effects of the internet and other forms of modern communication, which I know we're going to discuss, right?
Right, absolutely. Well, and I did want to talk about this today with you. I was looking forward to our conversation because I think that there are a lot of parents out there who don't know that this is the kind of entertainment their children are consuming. I think that there are a lot of, especially people who call themselves Christian, who don't realize how pervasive the occult is in our society. I know a woman who lives down the street from me who is educating her little girl on how to use a Ouija board. They had a conversation the other day with the little girl's deceased grandmother using the Ouija board. And I mean, this is becoming like the kid next door is doing this kind of thing. It's absolutely insane that we've gotten to that point. But yeah, I think the parents are so consumed with their own screens that they're not paying attention to what their kids are watching on their screens.
Yeah. Well, there's no question about it, Rebecca. And I've stressed for a long time now that people underestimate the effects of entertainment. When we talk about the brainwashing of the young and losing them to the so-called left, we talk about the schools, how the schools have become left-wing propaganda mills. But I would contend that entertainment is far more significant than the schools are, because think about all the entertainment that children imbibe. How many hours is it every week? And it has a very profound effect. When a child is in school, he may not listen to his teacher very closely. He may not even respect his teacher. But entertainment has almost a subliminal effect, because so many things are assumed in entertainment that are negative. And there's a saying, it's what's assumed that's learned best. And it's so significant for this reason. Plato, the ancient Greek philosopher, spoke about this. He said that it was very important to develop in the young, very young children, an erotic attachment to virtue. Now, by erotic, he didn't mean sexual, he meant emotional. And his reasoning was correct. He said that's because if you develop that in them when they're young, then when they reach the age of reason, they'll be more receptive to the dictates of reason. However, just as that could be done, much more easily you can inculcate children with an erotic attachment to vice. And that's what's happening today. And then, of course, when they reach the age of reason, they tend to become very unreasonable. Because what correlates with that vice-oriented emotional foundation, Rebecca, is negative, misbegotten, destructive, evil ideology. If you want to know why some people gravitate towards such ideology and other people don't, it largely has to do with their emotional foundation. And I'll give you a good example of this. Conservatives often lament that when you talk to liberals or far left-wingers, you can't reason with them. You try to apply logic and they just go off on an emotion-based tangent. And that's the reason why, because their foundation is incorrect. And as the twig is bent, so grows the tree. It's very, very significant. And I'll say here,
I'm sorry, I was going to say, I think there's a huge link here too with the opioid epidemic, because it's the biggest killer of individuals under the age of 30 right now, I think.
Right. Well, it's a systemic problem, obviously, there is no doubt about it. But like I said, I just think people underestimate the effects of entertainment. If they understood this issue more thoroughly, they'd be more vigilant about shielding their kids from negative influences. I mean, you have to remember that if you're exposing a child to negative entertainment for the first 7 years of his life, then you've given him a very poor foundation that may never be undone. I mean, that old Jesuit saying goes, show me a child that's 7 and I'll show you the man. It's absolutely true. And how effective is entertainment? Let me give you an example. I've spent a lot of time in upstate New York. Okay, now this is where you have got rural areas, I mean, real country. And you go back to when I was a child, Rebecca, up there, there was no internet, of course, and you didn't have cable television yet or satellite TV. You didn't even have VCRs at the time. Maybe they could pull in 2 television stations, and they didn't even pull them in well. The reception was often poor, and what was on them was very, very timid, relatively harmless fare. But I noticed something in the 90s when I was up there. All of a sudden, the boys up there, many of them, sons of farmers and whatnot, were dressing like gangbangers with baggy pants. Where did that come from? Where did it come from? There's no ghetto anywhere near these areas. They got it from entertainment, and that's the effect entertainment can have. Corresponding to this, there was an excellent study in the 1990s. What did it find? It found that you take any part of the world you want, Rebecca, 15 years after the introduction of television, crime shot way up. Why 15 years? Because that's the amount of time it takes to wean one generation on destructive entertainment fare, and for them to reach those peak crime commission years, let's say 15 to 30.
Life follows art, like the old saying goes. Selwyn, thank you so much for these insights. We're out of time, so we will be back right after this break.
I certainly would not want a constitutional convention. I mean, whoa. Who knows what would come out of that?
Just imagine if we have a constitutional convention, the number of people who will be unhappy and the number of people who say the results are not valid, and then they'll just ignore the entire Constitution.
What we need are just more people that would read the one we have.
It isn't the Constitution that's the problem. It is the people who ignore the Constitution, that usurp power and abuse the constitutional power that they ostensibly have.
If you can't enforce an existing piece of paper, how are you going to enforce a piece of paper that has a little more writing to it? In other words, it's been amended.
It's up to us to hold our elected officials accountable.
What can you do to elect good representatives and senators in your state legislature who understand the Constitution and are willing to take a stand?
All right, parents, listen up. We've all seen the countless examples of how radical leftists have been destroying American schools. It's no longer just about the terrible math and reading levels. Now, radical left teachers birthed from liberal universities are forcing gender indoctrination in kindergarten. They're teaching lessons on white guilt.
Freedom Project Academy has perfected live online learning over the course of a decade. I get a ton of great feedback about this program, a ton.
They're built on Judeo-Christian values, a classical curriculum. What does that mean? It means they're taught, your children are taught the way that the founding generations of the country. My own son Noah did Freedom Project Academy for several years when he was younger.
The more we tell our friends about these things, the more people will get on board, and I believe that we can be the catalyst to some real change.
We must save the West. Our way of life and our culture is under attack, and because of patriots like you and your project, I have optimism for the future.
The John Birch Society has been working tirelessly since 1958 to preserve freedom, safeguard the Constitution, and restore our God-given rights. We continually educate voters and lead the freedom movement. Join us as we work against a tyrannical one-world government. United as one, we can defeat this conspiracy against a free America. JBS founder Robert Welch said, "Education is our total strategy and truth our only weapon." Join us in restoring this great nation.
As a lumberjack, I've been cutting wood for decades. My job is pretty straightforward. I see the wood, I chop the wood. My axe goes through every time. You remember when everyone bought all the toilet paper? And they wanted me to wear these things? And someone invested a lot of money into this stuff. They say I'm part of a global plan. I don't think so. It's too hot, it's too cold. You know what? The weather changes. We even hear crazy ideas on how kids should learn.
Here's the news, Dad.
Is it, son? Is it?
What about this one, Dad?
Nope. It's hard to tell what's real and what's fake these days. There's just too much baloney out there. At the New American, they cut through the baloney and give me the truth.
Visit thenewamerican.com and subscribe to get 50% off the cover price. And if you want an even better deal, use the promo code 10OFF-SUB. Again, that's 10OFF-SUB for more than 50% off.
Welcome back to the New American TV, where we bring you the truth behind the news. There's a lot of legislation on Capitol Hill, as well as in various states, that's extremely important and therefore almost invariably ignored by major media. Joining us from our studio in Appleton, Wisconsin, to discuss some of these bills are two of our researchers, Peter Rakowski and Gary Benoit. Gentlemen, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Rebecca. Great to be on.
Well, what have you got for us today?
Well, today we're going to be talking about the Federal Reserve System, and I'm sure a lot of our viewers would probably think that the Federal Reserve goes back to the beginning of our republic. Of course, it does not. Is obvious when you take a look at history. It did not start until 1913, and it was created at that time. It was a huge blow against the republic because it gave the federal government the ability to monetize the debt, to simply create money out of thin air. And along with the income tax that also was established in 1913 through the 16th Amendment, those two devices have been used to create the inflation and the destruction of the currency, the ongoing destruction of the currency that we see today. Now, Peter, there is legislation in Congress to do something about the Federal Reserve, and I wish there was legislation that would actually end the beast, end this creature from Jekyll Island, as G. Edward Griffin called it. So far, we don't have legislation that goes that far, but what do we have and what can be done?
Yeah, ultimately, the Federal Reserve, as you mentioned, should be completely abolished, but there is a bill in Congress that will be a really good first step in that direction, and that is H.R. 24, the Federal Reserve Transparency Act of 2023. It's sponsored by U.S. Congressman Thomas Massie of Kentucky. It has 53 co-sponsors, which is a lot, at least in comparison to many other bills. And if this bill is passed, it would require the U.S. Comptroller General to conduct a full audit into the entire Federal Reserve System, which is very important because a full audit has never been conducted into the Federal Reserve for its entire history. So this would be huge. Now, we did have a partial audit in 2010, and this audit found a lot of very interesting things that the Federal Reserve was doing secretly. For example, during the 2008 financial crisis, it gave over $16 trillion in bailouts to banks and corporations around the world. And at the time, $16 trillion was more money than the entire U.S. economy. So a major amount of money. And also found other issues such as conflicts of interests, various ethical problems. So this was just a partial audit. So a full audit, I think, will, without any question, will be even more revealing and reveal a lot more issues and problems with the Federal Reserve.
Yeah, I think a full audit would shock the American people. No question about that. But what other legislation is there? Now, this is legislation in Congress. How about on the state level?
Yeah, there are actually several bills in multiple different states that have been introduced that would push back against the Federal Reserve at the state level, and in many cases help to nullify the Federal Reserve's unconstitutional monopoly on money. So, for example, and there are several bills in multiple states. One of them is in Missouri, House Bill 718 and Senate Bill 100. This bill would do multiple different things with regards to the Federal Reserve and with money. So, for example, it would officially recognize gold and silver as legal tender. It would end taxes on gold and silver, which would be a step towards treating it as currency. And then it would also create a state depository for gold and silver, which will help increase the state's financial independence from the Federal Reserve System. So for all of those, it would help nullify the Federal Reserve, help end its monopoly on currency, and doing it at the state level. And this is important because state governments, they have a duty and responsibility to enforce the U.S. Constitution, including the provisions that say that Congress is the one that coins the money rather than the Federal Reserve, and also says that states can only use gold and silver for the payment of debts.
And of course, when you say coin money, which is exactly what the Constitution does say, that doesn't mean coin paper, does it?
No, it does not.
Because obviously there are a lot of trees, and that really is a renewable resource. You can grow more trees and create all the money you want, but you can't really create gold and silver.
Yeah, and as you mentioned earlier, the Federal Reserve is responsible for the massive inflation we've been seeing, which has been very destructive for millions of ordinary Americans.
Right. And I'm sure a lot of people are confused by inflation, what it is, because they think in terms of inflation being simply rising prices, but actually rising prices are a consequence of inflation. And to just put it in very simple terms, I'm sure everybody has played the game of Monopoly. And in Monopoly, if maybe you were to cheat, if the banker were to cheat, and let's say give everybody an extra $1,000 or an extra $5,000, what do you think would happen to the values of the property in that Monopoly game, Peter?
You would be absolutely terrible.
Right. They would shoot up, wouldn't they?
Yeah.
And everybody knows that. And it really is the same thing with the national economy. And the Federal Reserve has this monopolistic power of counterfeiting money, essentially. I mean, just creating money out of thin air. And so when they do so, they flood the country with this new money, and it devalues the purchasing power of the money already in circulation. And so that causes prices to go up. But if we were to get back to sound money, the gold and silver, that problem would not exist.
Yeah, that is completely right. And that's what these state bills would do. So we have Missouri, We have multiple other states that have introduced similar bills. Tennessee, Oklahoma, West Virginia, South Carolina, Wisconsin, Mississippi, among others. In Wyoming, there was a bill just a few days ago that passed the state Senate by a single vote, 16 to 15, that would allow people to pay taxes using gold and silver,
right?
Which is another step in the right direction. Wyoming is actually one of the most supportive states of sound constitutional money, so this is another really good step in the right direction.
In a sense, it's like bartering, isn't it? But you have to have something that serves as a medium of exchange, which is actually what money is. For instance, if you have a farmer who has a cow and let's say he wants to buy an automobile, maybe the automobile dealer does not want to accept the cow. What's he going to do with a cow in exchange for his automobile? And so what happens is with a free market, the people who are part of that system, they'll come up with something that they will exchange that does not use value, that is durable, that can be divisible, so you're not getting a whole cow, for example. That's what we call money, that medium of exchange. And history has shown that what really works well as a medium of exchange is gold and silver. Certainly not paper money, not tied to gold and silver, where you can just print as much as you want.
Right, yeah, that is completely right. So,
gentlemen, if I can interject here too, we've only got a couple of more minutes before we need to go to break. Can you tell people how to learn more about these individual bills and then give some advice on what they can do once they find out the information?
Yes, anyone who wants to learn more about these bills, there are two places where people can go to do that. One is jbs.org/alerts, where we have all our legislative alerts, federal and state, including the ones that we mentioned. So the Audit the Fed bill in Congress, the state bills such as in Wyoming, Missouri, Tennessee, Oklahoma, etc. And then also jbs.org/Fed, which is our End the Federal Reserve Action Project page. And that page also includes the various legislative alerts that relate to either on the federal level or with the state with pushing back against the Federal Reserve. So I highly recommend anyone to go there to those two pages to find those alerts. And then also I encourage everyone to contact their state legislators, contact their members of Congress, U.S. Representative and U.S. Senators. Tell them to support, to sponsor, and to vote in favor of these bills, whether it's the Audit the Fed bill, bill in Congress to end the Fed entirely, or the state level bills to nullify the Federal Reserve and to restore constitutional money at the state level.
Absolutely. Very important point, especially because I think a lot of people do believe that the Federal Reserve is part of the federal government. It is not. It is a private banking cartel. They stole our gold more than 100 years ago, right, Gary? And
that's correct.
They've been printing.
And of course, not only is it not federal, it's not a reserve either.
Right. They've been printing counterfeit money ever since. So we really need to fight back against this because it's part of it. Our republic cannot stand without gold and silver as our currency. I really appreciate y'all's insights on this. We've run out of time for this break, and we encourage everybody to visit jbs.org to look into those alerts, and we will see you back after this message.
Sophia paused before the door. It read, Department of Bidigital Convergence. Just inside was a new world, a better world, the one of everlasting life, of no pain, of no loss, of no problem. She entered the chamber and her surroundings changed. She saw around her an infinite field of waving golden grain surmounted by cloudless blue sky. The AI voice whispered gently in her mind, Welcome to the singularity. She couldn't see it and couldn't feel it, but her body had almost instantly been covered by a swarm of tiny gray multi-legged bots that melted through her clothes and into her skin. Not perceiving the nightmare, her eyes had already been consumed and the rest of her body was dissolving as the bots digested her flesh. She felt only a warmth suffusing her being. Drowsy, she drifted to sleep, and her last thought was one of panic. Would she ever wake? Could a nightmare vision like this be an outcome of the much-hyped transhumanist technological singularity? Enter the world of the future as illuminated by the experience of the past in Endgame. the new book by Dennis Barrett, the publisher of the New American Magazine, and find out how the disastrous COVID pandemic response fits with the technocratic elite's thirst to create a transhumanist utopia. Get Endgame from shopjbs.org with free shipping with code ENDSHIP, ENDSHIP. Or get Endgame and the Great Reset Collector's issue of the New American Magazine and get free shipping plus an additional 20% off both with code N20, END20.
I certainly would not want a constitutional convention. I mean, whoa. Who knows what would come out of that?
It isn't the Constitution that's the problem. It is the people who ignore the Constitution.
What we need are just more people that would read the one we have.
It's up to us to hold our elected officials accountable.
Who understand the Constitution and are willing to take a stand when necessary.
If Americans want to remain a free and sovereign nation, more people need to understand the principles and values that built this great nation. At the John Birch Society, we have the organization, the plan, and the resources to do just that. Our founder, Robert Welch, said, "Education is our total strategy and truth our only weapon." Go to jbs.org to learn more, including how you can get involved to work locally and impact nationally. Join the John Birch Society today.
Here's the news, Dad.
Is it, son? Is it?
What about this one, Dad?
Nope. It's hard to tell what's real and what's fake these days. There's just too much baloney out there. At the New American, they cut through the baloney and give me the truth.
The truth is hard to find, but the New American has it. Check it out at thenewamerican.com.
Hi, I'm Alan Keyes. I'm the host of IMTV's daily talk show about news and events in America. And I want to say a good word for the New American Magazine. Not only because Alex Newman has joined us as somebody who is periodically hosting a show, but because New American Magazine represents a alternative media that is willing to tell people the truth. With so much fake news spreading about, and the fact that right now this country is in an existential crisis, we remember who we are and where we come from and what our principles are, or we die. Reading New American Magazine can keep you up to the minute on the issues that are challenging us as a people and on which that survival hangs. You can check it out and subscribe at www.thenewamerican.com.
Welcome back to the New American TV, where we bring you the truth behind the news. Many of you are aware that the New American Magazine is part of the John Birch Society, and our mission in the JBS is education for the purpose of defending and restoring our republic. I recently sat down with Steve Bonta, the executive senior editor of the New American, for a back to basics session. Steve has been a contributor for years to the New American, and his background is in education. Let's hear what he has to say on the topic of basic principles.
You know, I think this segment from time to time will be talking about basic principles because it's easy to forget with all the storm and stress of the news and everything that's going on in the world, all the complexities of politics and economics that really, at some level underneath, it's kind of simple. And we do ourselves a disservice at times as human beings by making things unnecessarily complex. And the reason it's simple is because the universe that we live in, this world we live in, was created on the basis of laws and principles. These things are real. And so we're going to talk about some of these principles from time to time, principles of human behavior and economics and politics and all these other things that kind of undergird all of the ideas that we're trying to defend, all of the system that we're trying to defend that was set up by the founding fathers. And the principle I wanted to talk about today, just a little bit, the first principle, is that there is such a thing as a principle. And this may seem self-evident, but to many, many people, it isn't. In fact, a large part of the problem that we have is that so many people deny the reality of principles, meaning principles of right and wrong, principles of good and evil, and all this kind of thing. And so whereas the founding fathers and the other enlightened men and women who kind of contributed to all of that, to the founding of the United States and in fact laying the foundation even before the United States was formed in Europe and so forth, all took for granted the reality of God and God-given principles and rights and so forth, it seems like there's always been a movement afoot to deny the reality of anything that you can't touch and hold, to say, in effect, that everything is material, okay, and principles are an illusion. So if you take that materialist or positivist perspective, then what happens is everything in the world becomes nothing more than a sort of a clash of interests and power, and the people who are most successful at acquiring wealth and pursuing bodily pleasure and all this kind of thing, these are the people who win. And the world becomes this very amoral, Hobbesian kind of place. So I think it's important to remind people of the reality of principles and the power of believing in principles. So a few years after the Revolutionary War was over, the War for Independence, James Madison, the father of the Constitution, a few years later, addressed the Virginia legislature, and he made the following observation. He said, "It is proper to take alarm at the first experiment on our liberties. We hold this prudent jealousy to be the first duty of citizens and one of the noblest characteristics of the late Revolution. The free men of America did not wait till usurped power had strengthened itself by exercise and entangled the question in precedents. They saw all the consequences in the principle, and they avoided the consequences by denying the principle." So James Madison believed in principles, and the fruits of those beliefs, of that conviction, are very evident in what followed in the next few years. Of course, the creation of the Constitution, his own very successful presidency a generation later, all of the rest of it. And I'm sure that these sentiments so eloquently expressed by him were shared by all the founders, but many people today don't believe in them.
And the reason we don't believe in them is because we have not been taught. I know when I was in school, and that was a long time ago, we were basically taught that there are no absolutes, which is a funny saying because it's an absolute statement. But what role do you see public education playing in this dumbing down of America to things that should be so self-evident?
Well, obviously, public education is a big part of the problem. But the secularization, and if I can coin a term, the deprincipalization of public education didn't occur in a vacuum. It came about because people allowed themselves to be persuaded, or at least a sufficient number of people allowed themselves to be persuaded ahead of time, that this whole idea of principles and moral absolutes and right and wrong was kind of old-fashioned and out of date and nonsensical. And once people became complacent in that regard, under the influence of many schools of philosophy, obviously the Frankfurt School of cultural Marxism and all of its outgrowths is a major source of this, but there have been others, postmodernism and all the rest of this, all of which are kind of unified in this idea that it's nonsensical to talk about principles, it's simplistic, and so forth and so on. Well, when you get enough people who either agree with that or at least maybe don't strongly disagree, then you begin to have fertile ground for the radicalization of institutions like public schools.
Right. Okay. And the outcome of all of this is what we see today, our amoral society. But on this program, we are dedicating this last section of every show we're calling it Taking Action. So how do we go, Steve, from this seemingly it's almost, you don't want to say despair, but it's almost despairing to look at our society and the complete lack of morals. It's not just an immoral society, it is truly amoral. It's hedonistic, it's materialistic. That God has been told, we don't want you. And he's a gentleman. He's not going to stick around where he's not wanted. He's left for all practical purposes. How do we turn this around? How do we take action and make our world a better place, which is the mission of the John Birch Society?
Well, we didn't get into this mess overnight, and we're not going to get out of it overnight. But at root, it is the consequence of generations of maleducation or of lack of education in these fundamental things. And it will be corrected by good education. And it won't be corrected overnight, but we can already see some evidence that this long-time strategy of education is having an effect. I really think that's the case. So, for example, if you look at this new 118th Congress and some of the things that they've been doing, the number of people in Congress now who clearly understand this, who are very principled and very fierce in defense of some of these principles. They may not win every battle. There are not enough of them yet, but there are a lot more than there were 10, 20, 30 years ago in Congress. And that didn't happen in a vacuum either. That happened because the last 10, 20, 30 years has seen sort of recrudescence of good education. So people learning about these principles, obviously the growth of the homeschooling movement is a very important factor in this, and many other things. So that process needs to continue. People need to be, and I hate to borrow a term from the left, but they do need to be re-educated, or perhaps better put, re-educated.
Right.
And that's what we're trying to achieve. It is really true that education is the key.
Right, to undo and not just educate ourselves, but educate our elected officials, educate our neighbors, so we can be all in the same boat on this.
Right, and here's the problem too with principles, is that they're not always self-evident. I mean, in some extent, we have a conscience, God-given conscience that helps us distinguish right and wrong. But when you get to the level of, say, asking, what would be a proper approach to economic policy? Why are free market economics better than planned economics, for example? Then if you don't have recourse to maybe somewhat more sophisticated principles, which need to be taught, by preceptors in some sense, they're not things that people necessarily are going to understand instinctively. That's something that needs to happen. Right? Because
Can you give us an example there?
Well, sure. For example, children being raised by their parents learn from experience that the secret to happiness and security is to have more or less all powerful authority figures that provide them with everything they want. Okay, and when they turn 18 and become nominally independent and go off to college, that's their default assumption, for the most part, that that's the way the world ought to work. That the government ought to have the role of a more or less benevolent parent, provide all of their wants and so forth and so on. Unless people, with rare exceptions, unless people are actually actively taught contrary to that the sort of the security of the home when you're growing up as a child is not the way the real world is or ought to work, they will not necessarily arrive at that conclusion on their own, or it may take a long time. And in the interim, as young radicals or whatever, they may do a lot of damage.
Absolutely. And that's why that is actually the kind of thing that we teach at Freedom Project Academy, which is the educational arm, the school. It is, isn't it? Is it kindergarten through 12? Is it K through 12 at FPA?
It is.
And and are you teaching at FPA, or are you involved
not
in
currently.
that?
I have in the past, but not recently.
You have in the past. And what has been your field over there?
Well, it's been quite a few years, like 8 or 10 years, but my recollection is I taught Latin and history.
And how many?
And maybe some English
languages?
as well.
How many languages do you know? I know you know quite a few.
A few, with varying degrees of competence.
So as far as your, how did the children react to that? How did the kids, roll their eyes? Oh, we have to study Latin, or did you see a real thirst for that true kind of knowledge?
Well, over the years, I've taught things like Latin in a number of venues, including, I've taught Latin history and principles of American government in China, as a matter of fact, in a communist country. And the reaction was generally very positive. It was interesting. So that to me was evidence that even in a culture where people are marinated in a set of ideas that are just antithetical to our own, or at least used to be, excuse me, this keeps falling out. Antithetical to our own, that people still responded. There's something deep inside us, the capacity, a God-given capacity to respond in a positive way when they hear truth being enunciated.
We need to come back another day because we're running out of time right now, but we need to have you back another day to talk about your China experience. And I don't even know how you got away with teaching that kind of thing in China. Did you have to turn out the lights and whisper?
That's a topic for another day, but
that is a topic for another day.
Sure.
Steve, you're exactly right. We have to understand our basics. So we have to have a firm foundation, or we're built on sand rather than the rock, just like our Lord said. That's all we have for this edition of the New American TV. We're following these and other headlines and topics at thenewamerican.com. We encourage you to visit us there, follow us on social media, sign up for legislative alerts at jbs.org. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you back here tomorrow.